Hello and welcome to Mission Perspectives, Module number 8. Today we come to look at two very important terms which in many ways can be linked clearly together. The first is the whole concept of incarnational ministry. This is a word which is often used when we describe the coming of Jesus into this world, the incarnation. We're told, of course, in John chapter 1 that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We read similar expressions in Philippians chapter 2 where it talks about Jesus taking on himself the form of a servant, coming in the form of the very beings that he himself had created. And as we consider Jesus' ministry amongst us, we see the most extraordinary identification with the people for whom he had come to seek and to save. But then, in addition to that, we will go on then to look at another term which has gained considerable popularity in probably the last 50 or so years in respect to the whole task of mission. It's the word contextualization. You've probably heard about it, and I'm sure will have already read something about it already by this stage. But the word contextualization became fairly popular around about the 1970s. In fact, it was a word that first began to appear in respect to mission in a paper that was prepared by the Theological Education Fund of the World Council of Churches. It was an endeavour to try and understand how we can conceive of ourselves as the Church of God and the task that God has for us of mission in this world. How do we actually engage that task? And so throughout this particular module, we'll also be looking at this whole concept of contextualization. Yes, a fairly recent term in many ways, and yet a very long established reality. And we will trace its history down throughout the scriptures. We'll look particularly at the incarnational ministry of Jesus and see how in so many ways he contextualized his message to the people of that first century. We will look at the apostles and we will see how they contextualize their message to both Jews and to Gentiles alike. We'll look specifically at the ministry of the Apostle Paul, and we will see how he adjusted his presentation of the gospel. Never the fundamental content, but the presentation of the gospel was adjusted based upon the audience that he was addressing at the time. And then we'll look at some more modern day concepts of contextualization. It is a subject that has brought about enormous debate in missiological circles. But we will look, for example, at the work of John Travis in the development of his C spectrum. C1 being at the one end of the spectrum, which basically talks about the notion of importing the gospel into another culture, and in that importation, in one sense, importing all of the primary culture's forms into that presentation as well. We would often see it in terms of missionaries who have gone into third world countries and yet have taken first world expressions of the gospel. It has sometimes been described as being to Christianize is to Westernize, to make people exactly like us in every respect. But then Travis, in trying to discern some of the various ways in which the gospel was being presented, he takes that spectrum right through to what he sometimes calls C6, which describes the insider movement, where people are being gospeled at a very grassroots level, oftentimes in great secret, and where the church itself does not have any outward visible form. But then, of course, there'll be others that we'll look at, like Phil Partial, who pushes back against some of the work that has been presented by John Travis, claiming a good degree of concern about what he calls syncretism, where the possibility is that people may in fact be willing to embrace the gospel, but at the same time still dearly wanting to hold on to the vestiges of their past, not only cultural practices, but their past religious practices. And then we'll look at the work of Larry Owen. Larry Owen, who of course expressed his concern about the potential of danger at both ends of this spectrum, the danger of under-contextualization, where we simply import not only the gospel, but all of our own cultural forms, and the dangers at the other end of the spectrum, where in one sense people are not being encouraged to recognise the fact that the gospel actually must begin to transform their culture. And then we'll look at the work of Paul Hibbert, who actually advocate strongly for a critical contextualisation, a recognition of those elements of culture which are not antithetical to the gospel, which in fact can not only be embraced but can be endorsed in the presentation of the gospel and can be used to help people truly understand the depth of the message of the gospel, but also recognising those elements of culture that are totally antithetical to the gospel and indeed must be rejected. And so as we delve into this subject, and a very important subject, I trust that you will be challenged, to think carefully through your own position and how you might effectively share the gospel with people in all kinds of cultural contexts, even here in your own location. Well, may God bless you richly as you study with us this week.